Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC into the ancient and prestigious gens Julia, a patrician family with an almost mythical origin within Roman tradition. According to this account, the Julii were descended from Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, through her son Aeneas, the Trojan hero who, following the fall of Troy, is said to have traveled to Italy to found the lineage that would eventually give rise to Rome. This legendary lineage not only conferred upon Caesar an aura of nobility and extraordinary destiny, but also served as a powerful political tool in a society deeply influenced by tradition and religion. However, by the time Caesar was born, his family's fortunes were no longer as great as they had been in previous centuries. Although they were patricians, the Julii were not among the most powerful families of the Republic. Even so, his family's circle was closely connected to Roman populist politics. His aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, one of the most influential figures in the populist camp opposing the conservative aristocracy. This blend of ancestral nobility, political ambition and tensions within the Republic would profoundly shape Caesar's youth. From a very early age, he was brought up in an environment where the prestige of one's lineage had to be accompanied by political skill, military valor, and a strong personal will. That combination of family myth and political reality would help to shape the character of a young man who would soon display a defiant, ambitious personality, determined to reclaim, and indeed surpass, the greatness that his lineage claimed to have inherited from the gods themselves. At the age of 18, Julius Caesar faced one of the first incidents that would reveal the defiant character that would define his entire political life. At that time, the Roman Republic was under the control of the powerful dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who had seized power following a violent civil war against the popular faction led by Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle-in-law. As part of his policy of purges and reprisals against his enemies, Sulla demanded that the young Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of Marius's principal allies and a political rival of the dictator. The aim was clear: to weaken Caesar's ties with the popular faction and force him to submit to the regime's new authority. However, in an extraordinary display of determination for someone of his age, Caesar flatly refused to obey the order. This decision was not merely a personal gesture, but a direct challenge to Sulla's absolute power. As a result, he was declared an outlaw, lost his inheritance, his marriage dowry and his social standing, and was forced to flee Rome to avoid capture or execution. During this period he lived in hiding, constantly changing his refuge whilst his enemies pursued him, an experience that forged his resilience, his capacity for political survival and his deep resentment towards aristocratic dictatorships. Eventually, thanks to the intervention of some influential relatives and priests, Sulla reluctantly agreed to pardon him. According to tradition, the dictator himself is said to have warned his followers that in that rebellious young man there were many Marios, anticipating the enormous power that Caesar would come to accumulate in the future. During his early years of political and military training, Julius Caesar was involved in one of the most famous and revealing episodes of his character. Whilst traveling across the Aegean Sea on his way to study oratory in Rhodes, he was captured by pirates from Cilicia, a region known at the time for harboring numerous pirate gangs that operated with relative impunity in the Mediterranean. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver for his release, but Caesar, far from being intimidated, reacted with a mixture of audacity and arrogance. He mocked them and assured them that they were asking for far too little, insisting that his ransom should be raised to 50 talents, a much larger sum which, according to him, reflected his true worth. During the weeks he remained captive, he lived among his captors with surprising calm. He would join in their conversations, recite poems and speeches to them, and repeatedly warn them, half in jest, half in earnest, that, once free, he would return to capture and crucify them. The pirates took these words as mere jests from a confident young Roman, but Caesar spoke with utter determination. After raising the ransom and regaining his freedom, he did exactly as he had promised. He quickly organized a small fleet, pursued the pirates, captured them and ordered their execution by crucifixion, demonstrating a blend of ruthless Roman discipline and personal resolve that foreshadowed the kind of leader he would become. This episode, as well as becoming a legendary anecdote from his youth, reflected the combination of courage, ambition and sense of honor that would define Caesar's career in the years to come. During his time as quaestor in Hispania, around 69 BC, Julius Caesar experienced a profoundly symbolic moment that revealed the scale of his ambitions. According to ancient sources, whilst in a town in the province, he came across a statue of Alexander the Great, the legendary Macedonian conqueror who had built one of the vastest empires of the ancient world before he turned 30. As he looked at it, Caesar fell silent and then burst into tears. When his companions asked him the reason for his reaction, he explained that he felt a deep sense of frustration at the thought that, at the age he was then, Alexander had already conquered much of the known world, whilst he had not yet achieved any truly memorable feat. This episode was not merely an expression of historical admiration, it reflected a direct comparison Caesar was making between his own life and that of the great conqueror. For an ambitious Roman, military and political glory was the path to immortality in the collective memory, and that moment before the statue marked a kind of inner awakening. From then on, the figure of Alexander became a silent model that fueled Caesar's determination to achieve comparable greatness, driving him to seek military campaigns, political prestige and a legacy that would place him amongst the greatest names in history. In 63 BC, Julius Caesar took one of the boldest political steps of his early career by standing for the office of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman religion and one of the most influential positions in the Republic. Despite being relatively young and competing against far more experienced and prestigious candidates within the Senate, Caesar decided to stake everything on victory. To secure the necessary support among voters, he waged an extremely costly campaign based on political favors and huge bribes, racking up colossal debts that could have ruined him if he lost the election. On the morning of the vote, fully aware of the immense risk he was taking, he bid farewell to his mother with a phrase that reflected his resolute and dramatic nature. He assured her that he would return home that day as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all. The stakes were high, as defeat would have meant political and financial ruin, and even exile. However, against many predictions, Caesar won the election and secured the office, which was, moreover, for life. Becoming Pontifex Maximus not only granted him enormous religious and social prestige within Rome, but also an official residence in the political heart of the city and a platform of power that strengthened his position against the senatorial aristocracy. This triumph demonstrated the extraordinary combination of audacity, ambition and political skill that would characterize his rise, establishing him as an increasingly influential figure within the complex structure of the Roman Republic. Around 60 BC, Julius Caesar took a decisive step towards consolidating his rise to power by forming a secret political alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey the Great, the celebrated victorious general in the East, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, considered the richest man in the Republic. This alliance, known to history as the First Triumvirate, was not an official state institution, but a private agreement through which the three leaders decided to pool their resources, military influence and economic power to dominate Roman politics and neutralize the resistance of the Senate, which viewed their ambitions with suspicion. Each member of the pact gained specific benefits. Pompey sought ratification of the decisions he had made during his campaigns in the East and the granting of land to his veterans. Crassus wanted economic advantages and measures favorable to his financial interests, and Caesar needed political support to attain the consulship and subsequently secure a military command that would allow him to gain glory and power. To reinforce the alliance, Caesar even married his daughter Julia to Pompey, creating a family bond that strengthened the trust between them. Many conservative senators viewed this union as a direct threat to the traditional balance of the Republic, as it concentrated an extraordinary amount of power in the hands of three men. Indeed, some contemporaries referred to this alliance with contempt as a three-headed monster, implying that the government of Rome had, in practice, come under the control of this powerful and ambitious trio. In 59 BC, Julius Caesar became consul, one of the highest offices in the Roman Republic, and used his position to aggressively push his political agenda. Officially, he shared power with his colleague, the conservative aristocrat Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a representative of the senatorial faction that opposed both Caesar and the influence of the First Triumvirate. From the outset of his term, the consulship became a political battleground. Caesar pushed through a series of agrarian laws designed to distribute public lands amongst the poor citizens and, in particular, amongst the veterans of General Pompey the Great, thereby strengthening his political alliance. Bibulus attempted to block these measures using religious and legal procedures, citing unfavorable omens to prevent the votes. However, Caesar openly ignored these maneuvers and continued to bring the laws directly before the popular assembly, supported by crowds and political allies. Tensions reached such a point that Bibulus, after suffering intimidation and seeing his authority completely undermined, decided to withdraw from public life and remain shut away in his home for much of the year, claiming he was observing the heavens in search of divine signs. In practice, Caesar ruled alone during that consulship, to the extent that a popular joke circulated in Rome claiming that it had not been the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but simply the consulship of Julius and Caesar, reflecting the absolute dominance he had exercised over politics during that turbulent year. After completing his consulship, Julius Caesar was appointed governor of several frontier provinces, which gave him the perfect opportunity to achieve the military glory he so sought. Between 58 and 50 BC, he led the famous Gallic Wars, an 8-year campaign that would radically transform the political map of Western Europe. During this war, Caesar confronted and defeated numerous Gallic and Belgian tribes, expanding the Roman Republic's dominion over a vast territory encompassing much of present-day France, Belgium and parts of Switzerland and Germany, practically doubling the area under Roman influence. Among his most notable enemies was Vercingetorix, leader of a major Gallic rebellion that sought to unite the tribes against Rome, but who was ultimately defeated by Caesar following a brutal and strategic campaign. During these wars, Caesar demonstrated not only his military prowess, but also his skill in political and psychological maneuvering. A famous example was when he ordered the construction of a gigantic wooden bridge across the river Rhine in just 10 days, allowing his legions to cross into Germanic territory. The aim was not to permanently conquer those lands, but to demonstrate to the Germanic tribes the extent of Roman power and deter future invasions. These campaigns made Caesar one of the most prestigious generals of his time, brought him immense wealth and, above all, the absolute loyalty of his legions, a factor that would soon prove decisive when the political conflict in Rome escalated into a civil war. The decisive moment of the Gallic Wars came in 52 BC during the famous siege of Alesia, where Julius Caesar faced the Gallic leader Vercingetorix in one of the most ingenious military operations of antiquity. After several campaigns of resistance, Vercingetorix took refuge with his forces in the fortified city of Alesia, situated on a hill and naturally protected by its geography. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would have resulted in heavy losses, Caesar decided to completely encircle the city with an impressive line of fortifications known as a circumvallation, a defensive wall stretching for tens of kilometers, complete with towers, moats and traps, designed to prevent any escape by the besieged Gauls. However, the situation was extremely dangerous. Caesar knew that a large Gallic army would attempt to break the siege from the outside to rescue the defenders. To counter this threat, he ordered the construction of a second line of walls on the outer side, known as the contravallation, thus creating a double defense system that protected his legions both from attacks from the besieged city and from reinforcing armies arriving from outside. For several days, fierce fighting raged simultaneously on both fronts, but the discipline and organization of the Roman legions ultimately prevailed. Finally, seeing that all hope of victory had vanished and that his people were on the brink of starvation, Vercingetorix decided to surrender to Caesar. The defeat sealed the fate of the Gallic resistance once and for all and secured Roman control over the region. The victory at Alesia was not only an extraordinary military triumph, but also a demonstration of Caesar's brilliant strategy, cementing his reputation as one of the most capable commanders in Roman history. In 49 BC, the political conflict between Julius Caesar and the Roman Senate reached a point of no return. Given the immense prestige and power Caesar had amassed during the Gallic Wars, many senators feared he would return to Rome with sufficient military influence to dominate the Republic. Under pressure from the aristocratic faction led by his former ally and now rival, Pompey the Great, the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, obedience meant losing his political power and possibly facing trials and persecution at the hands of his enemies. In that decisive moment, he marched with one of his legions towards the small but symbolic river Rubicon, which marked the legal boundary that no general could cross with armed troops into Italian territory. Crossing that river with an army was, in essence, a declaration of rebellion against the state. According to historical tradition, before advancing, Caesar uttered the famous phrase, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, accepting that there was no turning back. By crossing the Rubicon with his legions, he formally initiated a civil war that would pit his forces against those of Pompey and the Senate. This act became one of the most celebrated moments in Roman history, symbolizing the irrevocable decision to defy the established order and stake everything on absolute power. The civil war that began after the crossing of the Rubicon culminated in one of the most decisive battles in Roman history, the Battle of Pharsalus, fought in 48 BC in Greece. This battle saw the forces of Julius Caesar come face to face with those of the experienced General Pompey the Great, who enjoyed the support of the Senate and commanded a larger army. Despite his apparent disadvantage, Caesar once again demonstrated his extraordinary strategic skill. He reorganized his legions and deployed a special infantry reserve to neutralize Pompey's powerful cavalry, managing to break through his lines and cause the collapse of the rival army. The defeat was devastating for Pompey, who fled hastily to Egypt in the hope of finding refuge and reorganizing his cause. However, the situation took an unexpected turn. Upon his arrival, the advisors of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, seeking to win Caesar's favor, ordered Pompey's assassination before he could present himself before him. When Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly afterwards and was presented with the head of his former ally and rival, far from celebrating the gesture, he is said to have reacted with indignation and sadness, for Pompey had for years been one of Rome's greatest figures and, moreover, his former son-in-law. This episode marked the end of one of the Republic's leading figures and left Caesar with virtually no rivals capable of challenging his military and political supremacy. Following the death of Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt amidst a complex power struggle within the Ptolemaic dynasty. There he met Cleopatra VII, a young queen who was vying for the throne with her brother and co-regent, Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra sought Caesar's support to regain control of the kingdom, and according to historical tradition, she managed to meet him in a daring manner by being secretly smuggled into his chambers, wrapped in a carpet or sackcloth to evade her enemies. Caesar, who needed to stabilize Egypt, a key territory for the supply of grain to Rome, decided to intervene in the conflict. Thus began the so-called Alexandrian War, a series of intense battles that took place in and around the city of Alexandria. During these urban clashes, Caesar found himself in extremely dangerous situations. One of the most famous occurred when, during a battle near the harbor, he had to jump into the water to escape his enemies and swim to safety whilst holding important documents above the water. Finally, after months of fighting, the forces of Ptolemy XIII were defeated and Cleopatra was firmly installed on the throne of Egypt with Rome's backing. From then on, Caesar and Cleopatra maintained a relationship, both political and personal, that would become legendary, consolidating the queen's position and strengthening Roman influence in the Nile Valley. After consolidating his position in Egypt and supporting the rise of Cleopatra VII, Julius Caesar soon had to face new threats in the east. One of these came from Pharnaces II of Pontus, son of the famous king Mithridates VI, who had taken advantage of the chaos of the Roman civil war to invade territories allied with Rome in Asia Minor. Caesar reacted with his characteristic swiftness and marched against him, confronting him in 47 BC at the decisive Battle of Zela. The battle was surprisingly brief. Within hours, the Roman forces had crushed Pharnaces' army, putting an end to the rebellion after a campaign lasting barely a few days. To inform the Senate of the speed and decisiveness of his victory, Caesar sent an extraordinarily brief message that would become immortal in history: Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. With these three words, he summed up the speed with which he had arrived on the battlefield, assessed the situation and defeated his enemy. The phrase became one of the most famous symbols of Caesar's military genius and his ability to resolve conflicts with almost lightning-like efficiency, further cementing his reputation as an invincible commander in the Roman world. After years of military victories and his decisive triumph in the Civil War, Julius Caesar returned to Rome as the most powerful man in the Roman Republic. In 44 BC, the Senate, composed largely of allies or politicians seeking to secure his favor, conferred upon him the title of dictator for life, an extraordinary office that made him the state's ruler for life. Although the dictatorship was a legal office in Rome, it was traditionally granted only for short periods in times of crisis. Caesar's appointment to this post without any time limit represented a profound break with republican customs. Furthermore, he accumulated a series of honors and privileges that reinforced his authority. His image began to appear on coins, he was granted a special seat in the Senate, he wore symbols associated with royal power, and his figure was celebrated with statues and public ceremonies. For many Romans, especially among the senatorial aristocracy, these signs aroused growing fear, the suspicion that Caesar was paving the way to restore the monarchy, which had been abolished in Rome centuries earlier. Although Caesar introduced significant reforms, such as reorganizing the calendar, expanding the Senate, and promoting colonization projects and public works, his concentration of power generated mistrust and resentment among those who defended the republican tradition. Thus, whilst for some he was the savior of Rome and the architect of a new political order, for others he had become a direct threat to the republic's freedom, a conflict that would soon trigger the dramatic conclusion to his life. During his final years in power, Julius Caesar not only consolidated his political authority but also introduced a series of far-reaching reforms aimed at reorganizing and modernizing the Roman Republic. Among his most enduring achievements was the creation of the Julian calendar in 46 BC, a reform that completely overhauled the Roman system of timekeeping. Based on more precise astronomical calculations and with the advice of scholars from Alexandria, the new calendar established a year of 365 days with an additional day every 4 years, a system that became the basis of the calendar used in much of the world for over 1500 years and which still influences the modern calendar. Furthermore, Caesar considerably expanded the size of the Senate, incorporating new members from Italy and various regions of the empire, a measure aimed at weakening the political monopoly of the old Roman aristocracy and giving greater representation to the provincial elites. He also promoted policies aimed at integrating the conquered territories into the Roman structure, extending citizenship and encouraging the founding of colonies for veterans and citizens in various provinces. These reforms were intended to consolidate a broader, more organized and integrated state under the authority of Rome. However, for many traditional senators, these changes not only transformed the functioning of the Republic but also reinforced Caesar's personal power, heightening fears that his government was heading towards a monarchical system. Julius Caesar's fate was sealed on March 15, 44 BC, a date known in the Roman calendar as the Ides of March. As his power grew and the honors bestowed upon him seemed to bring him ever closer to the status of a king, a group of senators began to conspire with the aim of saving what they regarded as the freedom of the Roman Republic. The conspiracy brought together around 60 members of the political aristocracy, including two prominent figures, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Many of the conspirators had been allies or even beneficiaries of Caesar's clemency, which made the betrayal all the more dramatic. On that day, Caesar attended a Senate meeting being held at Pompey's theater. There, surrounded by the conspirators who pretended to present him with petitions, he was suddenly attacked with daggers concealed beneath their tunics. According to ancient sources, he received 23 stab wounds during the collective attack. Upon recognizing Brutus, whom he considered a close friend, among his attackers, tradition holds that he ceased to resist and fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey the Great, his former rival. With his death, the conspirators believed they had restored the Republic, but the outcome was quite different. The assassination triggered a new series of civil wars that would ultimately lead to the definitive end of the republican system and the birth of the Roman Empire. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March did not bring about the restoration of republican freedom that his assassins had hoped for. On the contrary, it plunged the Roman Republic into a new era of instability and civil wars. Following the assassination, the power vacuum sparked a struggle between various political and military factions. In his will, Caesar had adopted his young grandnephew Octavian as his son and heir. Octavian was barely 18 years old at the time. Although he initially appeared to be a minor figure compared to seasoned political and military leaders, Octavian quickly demonstrated extraordinary strategic and political skill. Over the following years, he was involved in a complex series of alliances, conflicts and confrontations, including the formation of the Second Triumvirate alongside Mark Antony and Gaius Lucius Lepidus, with the aim of avenging Caesar's death and eliminating the conspirators. After years of war, internal rivalries and further decisive battles, Octavian ultimately prevailed over all his adversaries. In 27 BC, the Senate bestowed upon him the title of Augustus, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire and the definitive end of the republican system that had governed Rome for centuries. Thus, Caesar's death did not halt his historical influence. On the contrary, his political, military and symbolic legacy paved the way for a new form of government that would transform the Roman world over the following centuries.